Put the gun down, or you're going to jail tonight." That's the last thing I said to Nolan Lance before Deputy Ray Pemberton had him face down on my driveway. Cuffs cinched so tight the man's wrist started to bruise before the cruiser even pulled away. I remember the smell most: hot asphalt, the metallic tang of gun oil still on my hands from the .45 I'd left on the porch rail, untouched because I made a decision 31 years ago in a place called Khe-Sanh that I was never going to point a loaded weapon at another human being unless there was no other option left on Earth. There was another option. There's always another option. That's the first thing they teach you, and it's the last thing people like Nolan Lance ever learn. My name is Gerald Kowalski. I'm 68 years old. I did 20 years in the United States Marine Corps, 2 tours, and I retired a Master Gunnery Sergeant in 1998. I bought my house on Cottonwood Ridge in 2004 with my wife Diane, God rest her, and I raised my son Tyler in that house. Well, my grandson, technically, but I stopped using that word the day his mother handed him to me at 11 months old and never looked back. He's 14 now. Quiet kid, builds model aircraft in the garage. Doesn't say much, but he notices everything, which is exactly why he was standing in our side yard on the afternoon of October 9th with a tape measure in his hand, checking a property stake his grandfather taught him how to read. That's when Nolan Lance came through the hedge line separating our lot from his. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He crossed 11 feet of my property, stopped 4 feet from my grandson, and pulled a pistol from his waistband because he'd convinced himself, or his wife had convinced him, that a 14-year-old boy with a tape measure was some kind of threat to the sanctity of Cottonwood Ridge Homeowners Association bylaws. His wife is Cheryl Lance. She's been HOA president for 6 years. And by the time this story ends, you're going to understand exactly how a woman who controls a homeowner's board convinces herself she also controls the law. I didn't raise my voice that day. I want to be clear about that up front, because people expect the retired Marine to come out swinging, and that's not how any of this worked. I've spent my whole adult life understanding that the loudest man in the yard is rarely the one who wins the fight that matters. The fight that mattered here wasn't going to happen on my lawn. It was going to happen in a courtroom 11 weeks later, in front of a judge who would look at Nolan Lance and ask him exactly one question he couldn't answer. He never saw that question coming, not on October 9th, and not for the 18 months before it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this actually started, 18 months earlier, with a fence 4 inches, and a woman who'd never lost a vote in her life. Cottonwood Ridge isn't the kind of neighborhood people picture when you say the words gated community. There's no gate. There's a stone sign at the entrance with a sprinkler system that runs at 6 in the morning and soaks the mailboxes if you're not careful. And there are 211 houses built between 1996 and 2001, mostly brick ranch and colonial, mostly retirees and empty nesters, with a scattering of younger families who bought in during the last decade because the school district is good and the lots are big. Diane and I moved here in 2004, 4 years after I put in my papers, because she wanted a yard big enough for a garden and I wanted quiet. For 15 years, that's exactly what we had. Cheryl Lance has been president of the Cottonwood Ridge Homeowners Association since 2019. She ran unopposed that first year, and unopposed every year since, because the seat pays nothing, demands hours nobody wants to give, and most people would rather mow their lawn on a Sunday than sit through a board meeting about paint colors. I don't fault her for wanting the job. I fault her for what she did with it. 6 years is a long time to hold any seat unopposed, long enough that a person can start to mistake a lack of challengers for a mandate, and long enough that the ordinary checks built into a system: another candidate, a contested vote, a board member willing to say no in front of the group instead of only in a hallway afterward. Simply stop existing. I don't think Cheryl set out in 2019 to become the kind of president who'd end up sitting silently in a courtroom watching her husband get sentenced. I think 6 years of nobody telling her no did that gradually, the way most things like that happen. Not all at once, but one unchallenged Tuesday night vote at a time. Under Cheryl, the Architectural Review Committee issued 412 violation notices in 5 years. I know the number because it came up in the case file later. Basketball hoops left in driveways past 9 p.m. Mailbox posts painted the wrong shade of white. A tool shed set 6 inches too close to a fence line. Most of it was petty. Some of it, I'll admit, was fair. The bylaws exist for a reason, and I've never had a problem with reasonable enforcement of rules everyone agreed to when they bought in. What I had a problem with was the pattern. The Ostrander family, 2 doors down, got cited 9 times in 3 years. The Petrosian house on the corner got cited twice for a garden gnome collection. Cheryl personally decided violated community aesthetic standards, a phrase that doesn't appear anywhere in the covenant. Meanwhile, the house directly behind Cheryl's, owned by a board member named Todd Fisk, ran an unregistered above-ground pool for 2 summers with 0 notices filed. I'm not naive enough to think every homeowners association in the country operates this way. I've talked to friends in other developments who describe boards that function exactly as intended: modest, procedural, occasionally tedious, rarely personal. Cottonwood Ridge wasn't one of those, and it took Nolan Lance putting a gun in my grandson's face for most of the neighborhood to finally say so out loud. I noticed the pattern. I didn't say much about it. That's not who I am. I served under officers I respected and officers I didn't, and I learned a long time ago that most fights aren't worth the ammunition. But patterns matter, and 18 months before that pistol came through the hedge, the pattern found its way to my front door. The dispute started over 4 inches of dirt. When Diane and I bought the house, the property line between our lot and the Lance lot next door had been marked by a survey stake driven in 1998, back when the subdivision was first platted. That stake sat at the base of an old hedgerow that both families had trimmed for years without incident. In March of the year before the incident, Nolan Lance, who I'd exchanged maybe 11 words with in 15 years of living beside him, had a private surveyor walk the boundary and came back claiming the original 1998 stake was off by 4 inches and that 4 inches of hedge and lawn belonged to his side. 4 inches. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because everything that followed, the fines, the notices, the emergency board vote, the pistol in my grandson's face, traces back to 4 inches of grass that nobody could even measure with the naked eye. I did what anyone reasonable would do. I commissioned my own licensed survey at my own expense, $640, from a firm that had done work for 3 other houses on the block. My survey confirmed the original 1998 line. I sent Nolan a copy, along with a short, polite letter, and I assumed, the way you assume most disputes between grown men end, that it was settled. It wasn't settled. It was handed to Cheryl. Here's a piece of this you need to understand clearly, because it's the piece Cheryl Lance either never understood or pretended not to. A homeowners association has authority over common areas and architectural guidelines that homeowners agree to when they sign the covenant. It has 0 authority over a recorded property boundary. A boundary dispute is a matter of deed and survey settled by a county recorder's office or, if it comes to that, a civil court, not by a vote of 5 neighbors sitting around a folding table in a clubhouse. Cheryl Lance sat on that board for 6 years. She had access to the bylaws. She chose to treat a boundary dispute like an architectural violation, because treating it that way gave her a lever she didn't otherwise have. In April, I received the first violation notice. Unauthorized boundary markers. Cottonwood Ridge Covenant, Section 4.2. The notice cited my own survey stakes, the ones from the licensed survey I'd paid for, as if I'd planted illegal fence posts in the dead of night. I responded in writing. I attached the survey. I received a second notice in May, identical language, as if my letter had never arrived. I went to exactly 1 HOA meeting that year. It was in March, in the clubhouse function room, folding chairs, a coffee urn that had clearly been in service since the Clinton administration. I sat through 50 minutes of business, a discussion about resurfacing the tennis courts, a debate over holiday decoration timelines, before the boundary issue came up as new business. Cheryl introduced it, framed it as an ongoing dispute requiring board guidance. I stood up. I said 11 words. This is a deed matter. It doesn't belong at this table. Then I sat back down. Those 11 words ended up in the court record months later, because Deputy Pemberton's report referenced witness statements from board members present that night, and because Prosecutor Naomi Getz used them to establish something important. That I had, from the very beginning, tried to keep this dispute inside its proper lane. I never yelled, I never threatened. I filed the survey, and I said my piece once, calmly, and then I went home. Tyler was 13 that spring, and he'd started spending Saturday mornings with me in the garage, working on a model P51 Mustang I'd bought him for his birthday. He's a quiet kid. His mother, my daughter Renee, moved to Arizona for work when he was 9, and he's lived with me full-time since, though she calls twice a week without fail and flies in for every holiday she can manage. He doesn't talk much about any of that. He measures things instead. Model kits, mostly, but also our yard, the fence line, the exact width of the hedgerow, because I'd shown him how to read a survey stake the way my own father showed me, back before I ever put on a uniform. It was a small thing between us. A grandfather teaching a grandson how property lines work, how to read a legal document, how patience beats a raised voice every time. Diane used to say I taught him precision the way other grandfathers teach fishing, badly disguised as a hobby, actually a lesson in paying attention to the world closely enough that it can't surprise you. I had no idea that spring that I was also teaching him the exact habit that would put him 4 feet from a loaded gun 18 months later. Nolan Lance, meanwhile, existed at the edge of my life the way a neighbor sometimes does, present but unknown. I knew his truck idled too long in his driveway some mornings. I knew he walked the property line with his phone out sometimes in the evening, documenting, though I never asked what. I never had a single conversation with the man that lasted longer than a wave. Cheryl ran the board. Nolan ran the phone camera and, it turned out, a growing resentment about 4 inches of dirt that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with his wife's need to win. I pulled our own copy of the covenant out of a filing cabinet sometime that spring, the same copy Diane and I had been handed at closing back in 2004, still in its original binder clip, and read through it cover to cover for maybe the first time since we'd signed it. 31 pages. Section 4 covers architectural guidelines, fence heights, exterior paint, satellite dish placement. Section 7 covers dispute resolution, and it says, in plain language, that boundary disputes between homeowners fall outside the association's enforcement authority and are to be resolved through applicable civil process. I underlined that sentence in pencil and kept the binder on my kitchen table for the better part of 2 years. It never once stopped being true, no matter how many notices arrived insisting otherwise. I want to say something plainly here because it matters for everything that follows. I am not a man who goes looking for conflict. 20 years in uniform teaches you the actual cost of it in a way civilian life rarely does. I've buried friends over decisions made in half a second under fire, and I came home from that with a settled conviction that most disagreements between grown adults don't need to become anything more than a phone call, a letter, or a handshake. I extended that same patience to Cheryl Lance for 18 months. I paid fines I didn't owe. I answered certified letters I didn't have to answer. I sat through 1 meeting and said 11 words. None of that was weakness. It was arithmetic, I understood, the way you understand terrain before you move across it, that a boundary dispute settled on paper would always outlast a boundary dispute settled by shouting, and I had no intention of handing Cheryl a version of events where I looked like the aggressor in my own front yard. What I didn't understand yet, sitting at that kitchen table with Diane's old reading glasses and a folder of certified mail, was that patience only works on people capable of recognizing when they've lost. Cheryl Lance had built 6 years of unopposed authority on never once losing a vote inside that clubhouse, and I don't think it had ever occurred to her that a deed recorded at the county courthouse existed entirely outside the reach of anything she could gavel through on a Tuesday night. That gap in understanding is where this whole story lives. It's the gap Nolan Lance walked through with a loaded pistol on October 9th, and it's the gap Cheryl kept insisting didn't exist, right up until a judge asked her husband a question neither of them had an answer for. The first fine arrived in June, $50, cited under Section 4.2 for unauthorized boundary markers. The same licensed survey stakes I'd already explained twice in writing. I paid it. $640 for a professional survey, 50 more to make a point disappear that wasn't mine to make disappear. I paid it the same week it arrived, by check, with a cover note that said only, "Paid under protest. Survey remains on file." I wanted a clean record. 20 years in the Corps teaches you that paper trails win wars that shouting never will. I've applied that lesson more than once in civilian life. A disputed insurance claim after a hailstorm damaged the roof in 2011. A warranty fight with a contractor over a botched water heater install. And it's never once failed me. The people who win these fights aren't the ones who yell loudest. They're the ones who still have every receipt 3 years later. A week after I paid it, I ran into Sam Ostrander at the hardware store on Route 9, filling a cart with fence post caps. I hadn't planned to bring up the HOA, but he brought it up himself, unprompted, once he saw the receipt for my own fence hardware in the cart. His family had been cited 9 times in 3 years, a wind chime once, a trailer parked in the driveway overnight twice, a shade of blue on his shutters that had apparently drifted from colonial blue to storm blue without his knowledge that such a distinction existed in the covenant. He told me, standing in that aisle with a box of screws in his hand, that he'd stopped fighting the notices 2 years earlier because it was cheaper to just pay them than to keep arguing with a woman who never lost. I remember driving home that afternoon, turning that sentence over in my head, cheaper to just pay them, and wondering how many other households on Cottonwood Ridge had quietly made the same calculation, and what that kind of unchallenged authority does to a person who holds it for 6 straight years without ever once being told no. The second certified letter, the one threatening the lien, ran to 3 pages, most of it boilerplate association language, but the final paragraph stood out enough that I read it 4 or 5 times the night it arrived. It stated that continued non-compliance may result in the filing of a lien against the property in an amount not to exceed legal fees incurred in enforcement action, which told me 2 things at once: that Cheryl's attorney, whoever was drafting these letters, understood the actual legal limits well enough to hedge the language carefully, and that Cheryl herself was willing to threaten a homeowner with financial consequences over a boundary her own board had no authority to redraw. I kept that letter. It's Exhibit 6 in the case file now, filed right behind the notebook.
Over the next 4 months, the notices kept coming. A certified letter in July restating the fine. A second certified letter in August threatening a lien against the property if the boundary encroachment wasn't corrected by removing my survey stakes. I looked into what that actually meant, because a lien is not a small word, and here's what I learned, and what I'd tell anyone in a similar spot. An HOA lien in most states can only attach for unpaid assessments or fines properly levied under the covenant, and it can be challenged in court, and it cannot override a county-recorded property survey. Cheryl either didn't know that or was betting I didn't. I did the research myself, sitting at my kitchen table with Diane's old reading glasses, because I wasn't going to let a woman with a gavel and a folding table talk me into moving a legal boundary that a licensed surveyor had already confirmed twice. Word travels fast in a neighborhood of 211 houses, and by midsummer I'd had 3 separate neighbors mention, carefully, over a fence or in the parking lot outside the community pool, that they'd heard about the Kowalski situation. Arlene Fitch, a retired schoolteacher who'd sat on the board with Cheryl for 4 years, stopped me outside the mailboxes in early August and told me, in a lowered voice, that she thought the whole thing had gone further than it should have, that she'd said as much in committee and been talked over. I didn't ask her to go on record, I just thanked her and went home. I mention it now because it matters later. Arlene wasn't a stranger to the pattern. She'd been watching it for years, quietly, the way people do when they're not ready to spend their own capital on someone else's fight. Around the same time, I spent an evening on the phone with a real estate attorney a friend from my old unit had recommended, a woman named Patricia Cho, who handled boundary disputes out of an office 40 minutes east. I paid for a single consultation, $90, mostly to confirm what I already suspected, that I had a strong civil case if the HOA ever tried to formally enforce the reclassification, that a lien filed on a fraudulent basis could itself expose the association to liability,
and that the smartest move available to me was exactly the one I'd already been making. Document everything. Respond in writing, never escalate in person. She used a phrase I still think about. Boring wins boundary disputes, she told me. Interesting loses them. I didn't fully understand what she meant until months later, sitting in that plea hearing watching a prosecutor lay out 18 months of dates and dollar amounts with no more emotion than a man reading a grocery list, and watching that flat, boring recitation do more damage to Nolan Lance than any amount of shouting ever could have. I asked Patricia, near the end of that call, what she thought would happen if the Lances ever escalated beyond paperwork. She paused for a second and told me most people who behave the way Cheryl was behaving eventually do escalate because a person who has never lost usually doesn't know how to recognize the moment they should stop pushing. I wrote that down too, in the same notebook, though at the time it read more like a lawyer's caution than a prediction. In late August, 6 weeks before the pistol, Nolan crossed the hedge line for the first time. It was dusk, maybe 7:15, the light going orange the way it does in late summer. I was on the porch with a cup of coffee when I saw him step through the gap in the hedge and crouch down at the disputed stake, phone light on, rechecking something that 2 licensed surveys had already settled. I walked down. I didn't raise my voice. "Evening, Nolan," I said. He straightened up fast, phone light swinging toward my face for a second before he lowered it. "Just confirming the line," he said. "Cheryl wants updated photos for the file." The line's confirmed, twice. Both surveys are on record with the county if Cheryl wants to look. She says the committee's still reviewing it. There's nothing to review. A licensed surveyor doesn't get overruled by a committee vote. That's not how deeds work, Nolan. He didn't answer that. He just walked back through the hedge without another word. I wrote the date and time down in a small notebook I keep in the kitchen drawer. August 24th, 7:16 p.m. The same notebook I'd been using for 18 months to log every notice, every fine, every certified letter. I didn't call the police. It didn't feel like a police matter yet. It felt like a man crossing a line he'd been told, twice, not to cross, and I logged it the way you log anything you suspect might matter later. That notebook ended up photocopied into the county prosecutor's case file. 11 entries. Every one of them calm, dated, and specific. I'll admit that encounter sat with me longer than I let on at the time. Not because I was afraid of Nolan Lance, a man who needs a phone light and a survey app to feel confident about 4 inches of grass has never struck me as dangerous, exactly, but because something about the way he wouldn't meet my eyes told me this wasn't really about the boundary anymore. It hadn't been about the boundary for a while. It was about a couple who'd never once, in 18 months, been told no, and didn't know what to do with the fact that they finally had been. Cheryl and I spoke exactly once during all of this, face to face, on September 2nd at the Community Labor Day picnic, a folding table affair with a grill someone's teenage son manned badly, and a cooler of soda for the kids. She approached me near the drinks table, and I want to be precise about what she said because it's the only time in the entire 18 months I heard her voice on the subject directly rather than through a letter. "You understand this isn't personal," she said. "The board has an obligation to protect community standards." I told her the board had no jurisdiction over a recorded deed, and that I'd be glad to walk her through both surveys again if she wanted, right there at the picnic table, no lawyers, no letters. She smiled. I remember the smile more than anything she said, a closed, practiced smile, and told me the matter was already being handled appropriately. Then she walked over to the grill and started talking to someone else about the tennis court resurfacing. That was the entire conversation. 40 seconds, maybe less, and in 40 seconds she told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. What I didn't understand yet, sitting at that kitchen table with Diane's old reading glasses and a folder of certified mail, was that patience only works on people capable of recognizing when they've lost. Cheryl Lance had built 6 years of unopposed authority on never once losing a vote inside that clubhouse, and I don't think it had ever occurred to her that a deed recorded at the county courthouse existed entirely outside the reach of anything she could gavel through on a Tuesday night.
In September, Cheryl called an emergency session of the Architectural Review Committee. I wasn't there. I was 3 hours away at the VA hospital in Columbus for a follow-up on a hip replacement, an appointment I'd had scheduled for 2 months. The committee voted 4-1 to reclassify the disputed 4 inches as Shared Access Common Area, a designation that exists nowhere in the original 1998 plat and directly contradicted 2 licensed surveys. The vote count matters, 4-1. The one dissenting vote came from Arlene Fitch, who told Deputy Pemberton months later, on record, that she'd voted no because it wasn't the board's line to redraw. 3 other board members voted yes, with what Arlene later described as almost no discussion at all. A show of hands, a motion seconded, gavelled through in under 4 minutes on an agenda that ran 9 items long that night. I've thought about that 4 minutes more than almost anything else in this story. 4 minutes to reclassify a piece of land that 2 licensed surveyors, working independently, had each spent the better part of a day measuring. I found out about the vote 3 days later, in a letter that arrived while I was still icing my hip from the surgery follow-up. I responded the way I'd responded to everything else, in writing, calmly, citing the recorded deed and both surveys, requesting the board rescind a decision that had no legal standing. I never got a response. 6 weeks passed with no further notices, no further letters, and for the first time in over a year, I let myself believe the whole matter had quietly died the way most bureaucratic overreach eventually does, buried under some other committee's more pressing business. I even mentioned it to Tyler one evening over dinner, told him I thought the fence thing was finally over, that sometimes these things just run out of steam when nobody feeds them anymore. He nodded and went back to his food, and I remember feeling, for the first time in a year and a half, like I could stop checking the mailbox with a knot in my stomach. I was wrong about that, though I wouldn't understand how wrong until the afternoon of October 9th. What I got instead of a resolution was October 9th. It started as an ordinary Saturday. I want to be honest about that because there's a temptation in stories like this to claim you felt something coming, some coiled dread in the morning air, and I didn't. It was 71 degrees. Diane's roses along the back fence, I still hadn't taken them out, 14 months after the funeral, and I wasn't ready to. Were past their bloom, but the bushes were full. 2 houses down, somebody was running a mower, that low steady drone that's been the sound of every Saturday in this neighborhood for 20 years. I'd made coffee at 7, read the paper on the porch until 8:30, and spent most of the morning in the garage sanding a wing panel for the Mustang while Tyler slept in. He'd stayed up late the night before finishing a school project, and I let him sleep because that's the kind of thing you can do for a 14-year-old on a Saturday. He came out around 1:30, ate a sandwich standing at the counter the way teenagers do, and wandered into the side yard sometime after 2 with the tape measure I'd given him for his 12th birthday, checking the boundary the way I'd taught him. Not because anyone asked him to, but because it had become a habit, a small ritual, the kind of thing a quiet kid does with his hands when he's thinking about something else entirely. I remember standing at the kitchen window for a second, watching him out there, the sun catching the top of his head, and thinking, not with any particular weight, just the ordinary passing thought of a grandfather watching a grandson do something familiar, that he'd gotten taller since spring, that his shoulders had started to square off the way a boy's do somewhere around 14, right before they stop being a boy's shoulders at all. I turned back to the sink. I was inside at the kitchen sink, running water over the coffee pot, when I heard the hedge branches move. I want to walk through exactly what happened next, in order, because the order is the entire case. Nolan Lance came through the gap in the hedge at 2:47 in the afternoon. I know the exact minute because it's in Deputy Pemberton's report, cross-referenced against the 911 call. He crossed 11 feet of my property, the same 11 feet that had been the subject of 2 licensed surveys, 1 HOA fine, 3 certified letters, and a 4-1 committee vote, and he stopped 4 feet from my grandson. Tyler told me later, quietly, the way he tells me everything, that Nolan didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, and then he reached behind his back. I've replayed the sound of that screen door 100 times since. The particular creak of the spring,
the way it always sticks a half second before it swings, because that's the sound that tells me, even now, exactly how much time I actually had. Less than I remembered feeling like I had. The whole yard went narrow the way it does when something in your training takes over before your thinking catches up. The mower 2 houses down, the smell of cut grass, all of it just fell away, and there was only the distance between the porch and my grandson, and the distance between my grandson and a man with his hand behind his back. I was already moving by the time I hit the porch. I saw the pistol clear the waistband of Nolan's jeans from 30 feet away, and every piece of training I'd ever had went cold and simple in about half a second. I did not go for my own weapon. A .45 I keep locked in a porch side cabinet, unloaded chamber, loaded magazine separate, the way I've kept it for 40 years, because the math was immediate and it was not close. A second armed man in that yard didn't make my grandson safer. It made the outcome less predictable. There is a lesson in 20 years of service that outlasts every other lesson, and it's this: the goal is never to win the fight. The goal is to end it before it becomes one. I walked, not ran, walked, because running reads as aggression and aggression is fuel. Down the porch steps and across the grass, and I put myself between Nolan Lance and my grandson with my hands open and low. 30 feet took longer than it should have, or maybe it just felt that way. The particular slow-motion stretch of time that shows up exactly twice in a man's life if he's lucky, and more than that if he isn't. I kept my voice in the same register I'd have used calling a formation to attention, no threat in it, no fear either, just the flat certainty of a man who has said this kind of sentence before and meant it every time. "Put the gun down, or you're going to jail tonight," I said, flat, no volume behind it. The same voice I'd used on 19-year-olds who thought bravado was a substitute for discipline. Nolan's hand was shaking. His voice wasn't. "He's on HOA property," he said. "I have every right to protect it." That's the first of his 2 lines. I remember it exactly because it was the single dumbest sentence I have ever heard a grown man say out loud, and because it's the sentence that, months later, a prosecutor read back to a courtroom word for word, slowly, letting each word land on its own before moving to the next. "There's no such thing as HOA property here," I said. "That's a recorded deed line. Point that thing at the ground or point it at me, but you are done pointing it at a 14-year-old boy." He held it another 4 or 5 seconds, long enough that I'll remember the exact color of the light that afternoon for the rest of my life. Gold and low, catching the hedge leaves, and then he lowered it to his side. Not holstered, just lowered. I could hear my own pulse in my ears in a way I hadn't in years, not since the range, not since the last time a weapon in someone else's hand had mattered to whether I went home that night. Tyler hadn't moved from where he was kneeling. I remember being grateful, in some small, clinical corner of my mind, even in that moment, that he'd frozen instead of run. Running draws an eye, draws a hand, and stillness, whatever else it costs a 14-year-old, had probably kept things from moving faster than they needed to. That's when Deputy Ray Pemberton's cruiser turned onto Cottonwood Court, lights on, no siren, because a neighbor 3 doors down had called 911 the moment she saw the pistol clear his waistband from her kitchen window. Pemberton didn't rush the scene. That's the thing about a good cop that people don't appreciate until they've watched one work. He got out slow, hand resting near his own holster but not on it, and he separated the 3 of us before he asked a single question. Tyler went to sit on the porch steps. I stood by the mailbox. Nolan stayed by the hedge, weapon now on the ground at Pemberton's instruction, and that's when Nolan said his second line, the one that ended up doing more damage to his case than anything else that day. "Ask my wife," he said. "She'll tell you the board already settled this." Pemberton didn't ask his wife. Pemberton asked for identification, asked Tyler what he'd seen, asked me what I'd seen, and then walked the property line himself with a small measuring wheel from his cruiser, cross-referencing it against the recorded plat map he pulled up on a tablet. He measured the exact distance Nolan had crossed onto my property, 11 feet, 4 inches from the disputed stake to where Tyler had been kneeling, and he wrote every number down before he asked me a single question about intent.
I stood there watching a man do methodically, in 14 minutes, what Cheryl Lance had refused to do in 18 months, actually measure the thing everyone had been arguing about. That's when I handed him the notebook.
18 months of dated entries, every fine, every certified letter, every notice, the August 24th encounter written down in real time, not reconstructed after the fact. Pemberton read through it standing in my driveway, flipping pages slowly, and I watched something change in his face. Not anger, nothing so simple as that, just the particular stillness of a man realizing a case has just gotten a great deal more straightforward than it looked 10 minutes ago. He asked me, at one point, without looking up from the notebook, whether I'd ever considered filing a restraining order after the August incident. I told him the truth, that it hadn't occurred to me because a man stepping onto my property once at dusk with a phone light didn't feel, at the time, like the kind of thing that escalates to a loaded pistol 6 weeks later. He nodded and kept reading. I don't think he disagreed with my reasoning. I think he'd just seen enough cases to know that most people don't see the escalation coming until it's already happened, and by then the only thing left to do is document it well enough that somebody else can see it clearly after the fact. He arrested Nolan Lance that afternoon on the porch on a charge of aggravated menacing with a deadly weapon, and that's the moment you already know, the one I opened with. The cuffs, the bruise starting on his wrist before the cruiser pulled away. Cheryl arrived 4 minutes later. She'd been at a book club 2 streets over, and I watched her go very still and very quiet at the end of the driveway. The same stillness I'd come to associate with a woman who was used to controlling every room she walked into and had just walked into one she couldn't. She didn't approach the cruiser. She didn't approach me. She stood by her own mailbox with her arms crossed, watching, until the cruiser pulled away with her husband in the back seat, and then she walked into her house and didn't come out again that day. 48 hours later, she tried anyway. The HOA newsletter that went out that Tuesday framed the incident as a property dispute escalation and referenced the September committee vote, the 4-1 decision reclassifying the boundary as evidence that Nolan had been protecting a designated shared access area. She called an emergency board session for that Thursday, and 3 neighbors told me afterward that she stood at the front of the clubhouse and used the phrase, defending common property, 4 separate times in a 20-minute statement. Nobody on the board challenged her that night, at least not out loud, though Arlene Fitch told me later she'd sat through the whole thing with her jaw tight, waiting for someone else to say what she was thinking. Nobody did. It took a criminal charge, not a board meeting, to finally end the pattern. I met with Prosecutor Naomi Getz 3 weeks after the arrest in a small office on the 2nd floor of the County Courthouse Annex government-issue carpet, a window unit rattling in the corner even though it was October. She'd already read the notebook twice by the time I sat down across from her, and she asked me a handful of clarifying questions, dates mostly, confirming the sequence I'd logged matched the certified mail record the HOA's own attorney had been forced to turn over. She told me, almost as an aside, that in 11 years handling cases in this county, she'd seen exactly 2 others where a homeowners association's internal paperwork ended up entered as evidence in a criminal case, and in both of those, like this one, the association's own record-keeping had done more to establish premeditation than anything the defense could argue away. It was during that meeting that I asked her the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the newsletter went out. Here's what Cheryl Lance either never understood or hoped nobody else did. A homeowners association board has no jurisdiction whatsoever over a criminal charge. None. A board can vote on paint colors, on fence heights, on whether a garden gnome violates aesthetic standards, and none of those votes reach an inch into a county prosecutor's authority to charge a man who pulled a loaded weapon on a minor. Those are 2 entirely separate systems of law, civil covenant on one side, criminal statute on the other, and no amount of parliamentary procedure in a clubhouse function room bridges that gap. Prosecutor Naomi Getz said almost exactly that to me, sitting across a table in her office 3 weeks later, when I asked her whether the board's vote would matter at all. It won't come up, she told me. Or if it does, it'll work against him. A board vote that contradicts 2 licensed surveys isn't a defense. It's evidence of premeditation. She filed the charge formally on October 22nd, aggravated menacing, a first-degree misdemeanor in our state, elevated in the initial filing toward a felony brandishing enhancement, given the presence of a minor victim and Nolan's prior documented trespass in August. The filing cited my notebook by exhibit number. It cited Deputy Pemberton's measurements. It cited the 4-to-1 committee vote not as a defense, but, exactly as gets predicted, as proof that Nolan had crossed that hedge line believing, wrongly, and in defiance of 2 surveys, that he had some standing to do it. Nolan's attorney pushed for a plea to a lesser charge within the first 2 weeks. Getz declined, telling me later that the presence of a minor and the documented prior trespass made a reduction inappropriate given the facts on record. That decision alone, she said, was the difference between what happened in that courtroom 11 weeks later and what might have happened if the case had settled quietly before a judge ever saw the file. The hearing itself, 11 weeks after the arrest, wasn't the theater people expect when they hear the word courtroom. No jury. A plea and sentencing hearing, quiet, procedural, a judge named Ellen Brackett who had clearly read every page of the file before either lawyer said a word. The room smelled like every county courtroom smells: old carpet, cold coffee, the faint hum of fluorescent lights that never quite go silent. I sat in the 3rd row in my one good sport coat, Tyler beside me in a collared shirt he'd picked out himself, and Prosecutor Naomi Getz walked the timeline for the court in the same flat, procedural tone she'd used with me in her office weeks earlier. The surveys, the fines, the notebook, the 4-to-1 vote, the 11 feet, the 4 feet, the exact minute on the 911 log. No raised voices, no theatrics, just numbers, laid down one after another like a man setting bricks. She asked Nolan one question directly, the question I mentioned back at the start of this. And it wasn't about the gun, and it wasn't about the fence. "Mr. Lance," she said, "can you explain to me what legal authority you believed you were acting under when you crossed onto private property to confront a 14-year-old? He didn't have an answer. His attorney tried to speak for him, and Judge Brackett waited him out, and the silence in that room stretched long enough that I understood, finally, sitting in the 3rd row with Tyler beside me, that this was the moment the whole 18 months had been leading to. Not the arrest, not the notebook, not even the gun. This. A man standing in front of a judge with no answer for why he thought a homeowner's bylaw gave him permission to point a weapon at a child. Cheryl sat 2 rows behind him, silent, the same stillness from the driveway, and for the first time in 6 years of unopposed elections and 412 violation notices, I watched her sit somewhere she couldn't run. Judge Brackett let the silence hold for what felt like a full minute before she finally spoke again, and when she did, her voice hadn't changed at all. Same flat procedural register she'd used for every other line in that hearing. She read the sentencing terms into the record the way she'd have read a grocery list, and it struck me, sitting there, that this was the entire lesson of the last 18 months distilled into one room. The law doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't need to. Nolan Lance was sentenced to 18 months of probation, a mandatory weapons possession restriction for the length of that probation, 40 hours of community service, and restitution of $1,100 covering my legal consultation fees and the survey costs the case file formally recognized as related expenses. He didn't go to prison. I want to be honest about that too, because I know some people expect this kind of story to end with the villain in a cell, and that's not always how the law works, and I've made peace with that. The point was never to see a man destroyed. The point was to see a system function the way it's supposed to function when someone crosses a line that was never his to cross. And in this case, slowly and without any help from raised voices, it did exactly that. I saw Nolan exactly once after the sentencing, at the county recorder's office of all places, both of us there on unrelated business weeks apart that happened to line up on the same Tuesday. He looked at me across the waiting room, and for a second I thought he might say something, an apology, an excuse, anything, but he just nodded once and looked back down at his paperwork. I nodded back. There wasn't anything left between us that needed saying out loud. The court record had already said all of it.
more precisely than either of us could have managed standing in a hallway.
Sam Ostrander stopped me at the mailboxes the week after the new board took over and told me, half joking, that his family hadn't received a single violation notice since Cheryl stepped down, not one in 5 months after 9 in 3 years. I don't know what to make of a number like that except to say it. Some patterns end quietly the moment the person holding the pen changes, and some things that looked for years like enforcement of the rules turn out, once you remove the person enforcing them, to have never really been about the rules at all. Cheryl Lance did not run for re-election the following spring. Nobody forced her out. There was no petition, no confrontation at a board meeting, nothing you could point to as a single decisive moment. She simply didn't file the paperwork when nominations opened in March, and the board that took over in April included Arlene Fitch, the woman whose single dissenting vote in September had turned out to matter more than anyone predicted at the time. The new board's first act was a formal review of the Architectural Committee's authority, and the 4-to-1 designation of my property as shared access was struck from the record without a single objection. Arlene called me herself to let me know, a short conversation, professional, almost embarrassed on her end, as if 6 years of watching a pattern and saying nothing was a debt she was only now getting around to settling. The board also passed, that same April meeting, a new procedural rule requiring any boundary-related complaint to be accompanied by a licensed survey before it could even be placed on an agenda. Small thing, costs nothing. Might have prevented all of this 18 months earlier if it had existed then. Tyler still checks the property stake. I noticed it about a month after the sentencing. He was out there on a Saturday morning with the same tape measure, kneeling at the same spot, and for a second, something in my chest went tight watching him do it. But I didn't say anything about that day. I just walked out and knelt down next to him, and we measured the line together, the way we used to, and neither one of us mentioned why it mattered more now than it used to. Some things a 14-year-old boy needs to work out with his hands instead of his words, and I know that better than most people, because I spent 2 tours learning the exact same lesson. His grades came back up that winter. Small thing, maybe unrelated, maybe not. I've never asked him to connect the two, and he's never offered to. He started sleeping with his door open again sometime around Thanksgiving, a detail I only noticed because I'd been quietly noticing its absence for weeks before that without letting myself think too hard about why. Renee called from Arizona the week after the hearing. She'd flown out for the sentencing itself, sat 2 seats down from me in that courtroom in a blazer she probably hadn't worn since her last job interview, and cried once, quietly, when the judge read the restitution terms into the record. She asked me on the phone, a few days after she'd flown back, whether I thought Tyler needed to talk to someone, a counselor, somebody trained for this kind of thing. I told her I thought that was her call to make as his mother, and that I'd support whatever she decided. They talked to someone twice, over video, that November. I don't know exactly what was said in those sessions, and I never asked. Some things belong to a boy and his mother, not to his grandfather, no matter how much of the daily raising fell to me. I've thought a great deal since October about the .45 that stayed on the porch rail that afternoon. People ask me sometimes, carefully, the way you ask a question you're not sure you're allowed to ask, whether I was tempted to reach for it. I wasn't, and I've tried to explain why in a way that doesn't sound like a lecture, because it isn't one. In Khe-Sanh, I watched men who trusted their weapon more than their judgment make decisions that cost lives, that didn't need to be lost. I made a promise to myself somewhere in that year that I would never again let a loaded weapon do the thinking a calm mind was capable of doing instead. That promise held on my own porch, 31 years later, with my grandson 4 feet from a gun that wasn't mine. It's the only thing I'm certain saved that afternoon from becoming a different story entirely. The kind of story that doesn't end with a courtroom and a probation sentence, but with 2 families and a deputy writing a report that reads nothing like this one.
I don't say any of this to claim some kind of moral high ground over Nolan Lance. A man who pulls a weapon on a child made a choice that has nothing to do with training or restraint, and I don't pretend to fully understand what led him to make it. I only know what I chose, standing on that porch,
and I know it was the only choice that ended with everyone walking away from that yard. I've had 31 years since Khe-Sanh to think about what that word, everyone, actually costs to protect, and I've never once regretted spending patience the way some men spend ammunition, slowly, and only when it counts. I think about the neighbors who told me, quietly, over 18 months, that they'd noticed the pattern and said nothing. Arlene at the mailboxes, Sam at the hardware store, 3 others whose names don't belong in this story because they never stepped forward when it mattered. I don't hold that against any of them. Silence is the easiest thing in the world to choose when the cost of speaking hasn't landed on your own front lawn yet. I understand that better now than I did 18 months ago, and it's changed the way I listen when a neighbor mentions, carefully, over a fence, that something doesn't sit right with them. Late on a Sunday, a few weeks after the sentencing, I was in the garage with Tyler, finishing the rudder assembly on that P-51 Mustang we'd started building the spring before any of this started. The radio was on low, some ball game out of Columbus neither of us was really following. Tyler had hung his tape measure on a hook by the garage door a few days earlier, the same hook where I keep my own tools, right next to where I've hung a folded flag in a glass case since 1998. It hangs there still. Retired, I suppose, the way I am, not because the line stopped mattering, but because it finally got settled the way it should have been settled 18 months earlier, by a survey, on paper, the quiet way most things that matter actually get resolved. Tyler held the rudder steady while the glue set, not saying much, the radio filling the silence between us the way it usually does on a Sunday, and somewhere around the 7th inning he asked me, out of nowhere, whether I thought the model would fly if we ever finished it properly. I told him most of them don't, not really, not the way the real ones did. He nodded like he already knew that, and kept holding the rudder steady anyway, and we didn't say anything else about it. Some things you finish not because they'll fly, but because finishing them is the whole point.